The evening sun was still hanging low when Loretta Baines stepped out of Mount Olive Baptist Church. The choir had just finished their last hymn, and the sound still floated softly in the warm Alabama air. Loretta was 72, gentle and steady, her small hands wrapped around a worn brown cane and her old Bible pressed against her chest. The church had been her second home for more than 40 years. Every Sunday she stood in that same doorway, waved goodbye to the other ladies, and waited for her friend Thelma to pull the car around. That evening, the street felt quieter than usual. The sky had that orange glow that makes everything look kind for a moment. But then came the noise, voices raised, sharp and sudden. Down the block, blue and red lights flickered against the chain-link fence. 2 police cars sat at an angle, doors open, engines still running. Loretta squinted, trying to make sense of it. A young man stood near a beat-up Nissan, his hands trembling as one of the officers barked orders. "Hands out the window!" "No, get out of the car, now!" The boy froze, caught between fear and confusion. Loretta could feel the tension in the air, the kind that makes your stomach twist. She wasn't trying to get involved. She'd seen too much in her years to want trouble. But something inside her, the part that had spent decades teaching third graders to calm down and breathe, made her speak up. She lifted her voice, soft and warm, the way a mother would. "Y'all be careful now," she called. That's all she said. Just those few words. But the officer closest to her turned his head. He was young, maybe mid-20s, face tight with adrenaline and pride. "Ma'am, back up," he shouted, stepping toward her. Loretta blinked. "I'm just standing on the church steps, son. I'm not near y'all." Her voice was calm, polite, the kind that came from years of Sunday school lessons and patience. "I said back up," he barked again, motioning with his hand. She looked down at her cane, then at the short distance between her and the edge of the sidewalk. "My knees don't back up that fast, baby," she said with a faint smile, trying to lighten the air. But the officer didn't smile back. His jaw clenched. Maybe he thought she was testing him. Maybe he was just tired. But whatever it was, he reached forward and grabbed for her cane. Loretta tried to hold on, but the movement was too sudden. Her balance gave out. Her foot slipped on the uneven pavement, and her body followed. The sound was small but sharp. A gasp, a thud, a Bible hitting the ground. The world went still for a moment. The church ladies froze. Someone across the street screamed, "Why did you do that?" She didn't do nothing. Loretta lay on the pavement, her beige hat rolling away, one hand twitching as she tried to pull herself up. Her breath came out shaky, thin. The officer stepped back, eyes wide, realizing too late what he'd done. But Loretta didn't yell. She didn't curse. She just lifted her head slightly, her voice trembling but clear. "Let me make one call," she whispered. An older woman from the church rushed to her side. "Don't move, baby, help is coming." Loretta shook her head weakly. "Just one call," she repeated. The officer hesitated, then handed her the phone. Maybe he thought it didn't matter. Maybe he felt a little guilt. She dialed slowly, her fingers shaking but sure. No contact list, no voice command, just memory. She pressed one number, lifted the phone to her ear, and waited. It rang once. Then a man's voice answered. "Hey, Ma." She didn't say much. Only a few quiet words. But whatever she said made him go completely still on the other end. A small crowd had gathered now. Neighbors, church members, strangers. The sirens were still somewhere in the distance. But for Loretta, everything around her faded into a blur. She closed her eyes and let the phone rest on her chest. Nobody there that night knew who she'd just called. Nobody knew that her son, Darius Baines, was a man who'd served in places no map bothered to name. A man who'd spent years working missions so silent they left no trace. A man who'd walked away from it all to live a quiet life and take care of the only person who ever called him baby. And now, that quiet life was about to end, the crowd whispered. The flashing lights painted the walls of the church red and blue, and Loretta lay there still holding her Bible, her fingers brushing over its worn pages. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, but in her heart she knew help was already on the way, the kind of help that didn't come in a uniform. Because when a mother calls her son, and that son has spent his life protecting others, there's no force on earth strong enough to stop him from coming. That night, before the ambulance even reached the church, a single name flashed across a phone screen hundreds of miles away. Mama. And with that, Darius Baines stood up from his chair, his face calm, his eyes hard, and whispered to himself, "All right, The story of what happened next would shake an entire city, but it all started here. On a quiet Sunday evening, when a kind woman with a cane and a Bible simply said, "Y'all be careful now." The phone call lasted less than 20 seconds. That was all it took. When Darius Baines heard his mother's voice that night, something in him shifted. It wasn't panic. Darius didn't panic. It was deeper than that. Something old and buried that woke up like an instinct. Her voice was soft, almost too soft. He could hear pain hiding behind every word. "Baby," she whispered. "They hurt me." Then the line went quiet. He stood still in the center of his small kitchen, staring at the cracked tile floor. The only sound was the ceiling fan spinning above his head, clicking every few seconds like a heartbeat. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He'd promised her years ago, after his father's funeral, that if she ever needed him, she'd never have to explain. Just call. That was enough. Darius set the phone down on the counter. For 5 seconds, he didn't move. Then he exhaled once, slow and heavy, and his eyes changed, calm, but colder. He walked down the narrow hallway of his house in Temple, Texas. The walls were plain, the shelves half empty except for an old photograph of his parents, his father in a mechanic's uniform, his mother smiling proudly beside him, Bible in hand. He touched the photo frame gently, then turned away. In the bedroom closet sat a weathered army green duffel bag. He pulled it out and unzipped it. Inside were the pieces of a life he had left behind. A folded military jacket, a pair of black gloves, a small case with a satellite phone, and a sealed folder wrapped in plastic. He didn't pack clothes. He didn't take food. He just took what mattered: 2 phones, that folder, and his mother's last words echoing in his head. By the time he stepped outside, the air had grown still. Crickets sang somewhere out in the tall grass, and the faint glow of his truck's headlights cut through the darkness. His neighbor Chuck, an old man with a white beard who ran the scrapyard, waved from his porch. "Headin' somewhere, D?" Chuck called. Darius gave a short nod. "Home," he said simply. Chuck smiled. "Tell Miss Loretta I said hey." Darius nodded again and climbed into his truck. The engine rumbled to life, and he pulled onto the road without another word. The drive east felt endless. Miles of open highway and heavy silence. The radio stayed off. The only thing he could hear was the low hum of the tires and the storm building somewhere in his chest. Every few minutes he caught himself gripping the steering wheel too tight, forcing his hands to loosen. He thought about his mother, how she never asked for much, how she always believed in grace even when the world gave her none. She'd raised him on faith and quiet strength. She'd always told him, "You don't need to be loud to stand tall, baby." But tonight, quiet didn't feel right. He crossed the Texas border just after midnight. The road stretched out before him like a dark ribbon, the stars barely visible through the clouds. Somewhere near the Mississippi line, he stopped for gas. The clerk, a young woman in a hoodie, gave him a polite nod. "Long drive?" she asked. Darius looked up from the pump. "Yeah," he said softly. "Long night." She smiled awkwardly, not knowing what else to say. He gave her a quiet thank you and got back in the truck. As he drove off, he checked his rearview mirror and whispered to himself, "Hold on, Ma. I'm coming." By the time he reached Birmingham, dawn had barely broken. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a city wakes up, before traffic, before noise, before truth. He parked near the hospital where he knew his mother would be. He walked through the side entrance, not the main one. Old habit. Moving through places unnoticed had once been his job. The nurse at the desk looked up, startled but polite. "Sir, can I help you?" "Loretta Baines," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Relation?" "I'm her son." Something in his eyes told the nurse not to argue. She pointed toward the West Wing. "Room 204. Darius walked the hallway slowly, each step heavier than the last. When he reached her door, he paused, took a breath, and opened it. Loretta lay there, pale but awake. A white bandage covered her temple, and the IV line glowed faintly beside her. Her cane leaned against the bed, the same one that had been used to pull her down. Her eyes opened, and when she saw him, her lips curved into a tired smile. "Hey, baby." Darius stepped closer and kissed her forehead gently. "You all right?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She nodded weakly. Could have been worse. He sat down beside her, took her hand, and held it for a long time without speaking. The machines beeped softly in the background. After a while, Loretta said, You came all this way. He squeezed her hand. Didn't have far to come. She looked at him, her eyes tired but knowing. You gonna fix this, aren't you? He didn't answer right away. Then, in that quiet, steady voice of his, he said, Yes, ma'am. She sighed. Don't do anything foolish, Darius. He smiled faintly. I don't do foolish, Ma. I do what's right. Loretta turned her head toward the window where the morning light was just beginning to break through the blinds. You sure that's still the same thing? She whispered. Darius didn't reply. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the fading bruises on her arm, and the silence between them said everything words couldn't. When the nurse came in, Loretta drifted back to sleep. Darius stood, brushed a hand over her blanket, and walked out quietly. Outside the hospital, the air felt heavier than before. He leaned against his truck, watching the sunrise turn the sky gold and red. Then he pulled out his phone and opened a contact labeled Auric, an old name from another life. When the line clicked open, Darius said just one thing. I need you to pull a badge number. There was a pause on the other end. Which city? Birmingham PD. Officer on scene at Mount Olive Baptist around 6. Badge 6543. The voice said, Understood. Darius ended the call, pocketed his phone, and looked toward the horizon. He'd promised his mother he'd make things right. And for Darius Baines, a promise wasn't just words. It was a mission. The next morning, the hospital smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. The steady beeping of machines echoed softly through the hallways. Darius hadn't slept. He'd spent the night sitting by his mother's bedside, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing and the occasional murmur from nurses outside the door. When the sun began to rise, he finally stood, stretched his back, and looked at her again. Her hand still held on to his like she was afraid to let go. He leaned down and whispered, I'll be back soon. Ma, you rest now. Loretta didn't open her eyes, but she gave a faint squeeze of his hand, just enough to say she understood. Darius walked out of the hospital and into the sharp morning air. The city was waking up. Buses groaning down the street, shop owners unlocking doors, birds making noise over the hum of traffic. Everything looked normal. But for him, the world had changed. He drove to the church first. Mount Olive Baptist stood quiet under the early sun. The yellow tape from last night had been removed as if nothing had ever happened. A few church members were sweeping the steps, shaking their heads, whispering to one another. When they saw him, they stopped. One of the women, Mrs. Thelma Griggs, hurried over, wiping her hands on her apron. Darius, baby, she said softly. Your mama. She's all right? She's stable, he replied. Mrs. Griggs sighed with relief, then her face tightened. What they did to her, Lord have mercy. We told that man she wasn't doing nothing. Just standing there. You saw it happen? Darius asked. I saw it all, she said. He grabbed her cane like she was some kind of threat. She hit that ground so fast. Anybody record it? Thelma nodded toward a teenager standing near the fence holding his phone. That boy over there, and he filmed it. Whole thing. Darius walked over, calm and respectful. The kid looked nervous at first, but handed over his phone without a word. The footage was clear, painfully clear. His mother standing still, her voice calm. Then the sudden pull, the fall, the sound of her Bible hitting the pavement. Darius didn't react. His face stayed still, but inside something tightened like a wire. He copied the video onto his drive, handed the phone back, and thanked the boy quietly. When he turned back, Reverend Ingram was standing by the church doors holding 2 cups of coffee. Knew you'd show up, the Reverend said. Darius took the cup and nodded. You tried to help her. The Reverend sighed. I did. Told the officers she was with the church, not in their way. They told me to back off or I'd be arrested for obstruction. Darius looked up at the crooked utility pole across the street. A camera sat there, half-bent, pointing down at the road. That city camera still working? Only when they want it to, the Reverend said bitterly. I'll find out, Darius murmured. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, and walked toward his truck. He didn't tell anyone what he was about to do. He never did. His next stop was the Birmingham Police Department's South Precinct, a red brick building wedged between a pawn shop and an auto repair store. Darius parked out front, took a deep breath, and walked in. His boots made no sound on the tile floor. A young officer behind the counter looked up. Can I help you, sir? Yes, Darius said evenly. I need to speak to whoever's handling the incident that took place outside Mount Olive Baptist last night. The officer frowned. Incident? With Officer Alan Detmer, Darius added. Badge number 6543. The young man blinked. I'm not sure. I'm not here to argue, Darius interrupted, voice still calm but heavy. I'm here to speak to the watch commander. The officer hesitated, then picked up the phone. A few minutes later, a tall man in his 40s walked out of the hallway. Lieutenant Ronald Green, he said, extending a hand. Darius didn't take it. I'm Darius Baines. The woman your officer knocked down is my mother. Green cleared his throat. I heard about that. It's under review. No, it's not, Darius said, sliding a small folder across the counter. No report was filed. No footage submitted. Your officer left before the ambulance even arrived. That's not a review. That's a cover-up. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. Now hold on. I'm sure it's more complicated than that. Not really, Darius said. I've seen the video. Green looked uneasy. If you'd like to file a complaint. I don't file complaints, Darius said quietly. I build evidence. For a moment, neither man spoke. The room felt colder. Green's tone softened, but only slightly. I understand you're upset. I'm not upset, Darius replied. Upset is when somebody cuts you off in traffic. This is different, Green exhaled. Look, there's a process. You can't just... I've dealt with processes before, Darius said, cutting him off, in places where they meant life or death. The difference is those people didn't pretend it was justice. He turned to leave but paused at the door. Tell Officer Detmer not to delete anything from his phone. If he does, I'll get it back anyway. Cloud backups are forever. When he stepped outside, the young officer behind the counter exhaled hard, like he'd been holding his breath the entire time. Darius walked back to his truck, opened his laptop, and began typing. He sent the video to 3 encrypted drives and 2 lawyers he trusted. Then he opened a private folder labeled Records. Inside were data files, archived contacts, and tools from his old life. Not weapons, but information. He typed in the badge number, 6543. The database began pulling. Within minutes, details appeared. Officer Alan Detmer. 2 years on the force. Prior misconduct in Gadsden PD. Case closed without charges. Darius leaned back in his seat, eyes narrowing slightly. There it is, he whispered. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just took a slow breath and saved the file. Then, almost out of habit, he opened a map on his phone. The route from the precinct to the church. From the church to the hospital. Every street and alley between them. He wasn't planning an attack. He was planning the truth. Because in his mind, the mission wasn't about vengeance. It was about exposure. He drove back to the hospital that afternoon and sat by his mother again. She was awake this time, sipping water, watching the light spill through the blinds. You went looking, she said quietly. I did. Find what you were looking for? Not yet, Loretta sighed. You be careful, Darius. This world don't like men who dig too deep. He looked at her, his expression softening. Then I guess it's about time somebody did. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the flags in front of the hospital. Inside, Darius opened his laptop again and began building a new file. One that would make sure no one could bury what happened to Loretta Baines ever again. And as the first drops of rain tapped against the window, Darius whispered to himself, let's begin. The rain had stopped by the time Darius left the hospital. The air smelled like wet pavement and pine. He sat in his truck for a long moment, listening to the rainwater dripping from the trees, letting his thoughts settle. Then he started the engine and drove to the outskirts of town, to a small diner that opened early for truckers and night shift workers. Inside, the smell of bacon and old coffee filled the air. He took a corner booth, his back to the wall, a habit he never broke. He ordered nothing, just opened his laptop and connected his secure network. The files he'd pulled on Officer Detmer were just the beginning. On paper, the man was clean. 2 years on the job. Minor commendations, no formal discipline. But Darius knew how these systems worked. Records could be rewritten. And in small cities like Birmingham, protection came through silence, not honesty. He typed in another query, this time cross-referencing internal transfers between Gadsden PD and Birmingham PD over the past 5 years. The results came slow, line by line. One name repeated twice, Alan Detmer, flagged for a use of force complaint involving a teenager. Case dismissed. Footage missing. He leaned back, eyes on the screen, and said quietly to himself, "You didn't learn your lesson, did you?" The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, came by with a coffee pot. "You need a refill, hun?" He nodded, grateful for the warmth. She poured, then studied him for a moment. "You look like you've been awake for days." "Just one long one," he said. She gave a knowing smile and walked off, leaving him to his silence. After finishing his coffee, Darius called a number saved under the name Auric. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Deep and rough, got your file," the man said. "Your boy's got a record, all right." Internal Affairs shut it down before it reached the DA. Somebody higher up didn't want a paper trail. "Send me everything," Darius said. "Already did. But be careful, D. This one smells political. Folks don't like their secrets touched." Darius hung up without a word. He didn't need warnings. He'd lived through worse. By late afternoon, he was parked outside the precinct again. This time, he didn't go in. He sat across the street watching. He noticed the rhythm of the place. Officers coming and going. The same two detectives stepping out every hour to smoke. A man in a suit entering through the side door where visitors weren't supposed to. He opened his laptop again and began tracking the precinct's public network. He wasn't hacking, not yet, just listening. Monitoring open signals, unencrypted data. The kind of noise most people ignored. After 20 minutes, a name popped up. Lieutenant Ronald Green. The same man he'd spoken to earlier that morning. A message appeared in the local log, short and coded. "No report filed. Handle internally. Keep IA out." Darius sat still, reading it twice. Then he whispered, "Got you." He copied the file, time-stamped it, and saved it to 3 separate encrypted drives. It was then that his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Is this Darius Baines?" The voice was female, sharp but calm. "Who's asking?" "Sergeant Kristen Malone, Internal Affairs. I heard you stopped by the precinct this morning." "I did. I'd like to meet. I think we're looking at the same mess." He paused. "If you're IA, why are you calling me on a private line?" "Because not everyone in my department plays by the book," she said. "And I don't trust them to keep this quiet. Can you meet me at Miller's Cafe in an hour?" Darius glanced around. "I'm already here." She arrived exactly 50 minutes later. Mid-30s, hair pulled back tight, eyes that had seen too much and learned not to flinch. She slid into the booth across from him, ordered tea, and folded her hands. "I've been with IA for 6 years," she said quietly. "Long enough to know when something smells wrong. The moment your mother's name hit the intake sheet, the case was frozen. That doesn't happen unless someone up top ordered it." Darius studied her face. "So why tell me?" "Because it's not right," she said simply. "And because people like Detmer make all of us look dirty." He nodded slowly. "You got proof?" "Not yet," she said. "But I know where to start. There's a secondary database, restricted. Only senior officers have access. If we can get the logs from last night, we'll know who deleted the body cam footage." "We?" Darius asked. She held his gaze. "You said you're looking for truth, not revenge." "So am I, but I'll need your help." "Quiet help." He leaned forward slightly. "You'll have it." They talked for 20 minutes, low voices, short sentences. When she left, she gave him a small flash drive. "Back up everything," she said. "If they come for you, I can't protect you." "They won't need to," he said. After she walked out, Darius sat alone, staring at his reflection in the window. The rain had started again, soft and steady. Outside, the neon sign flickered in the puddles. He pulled the flash drive from his pocket, plugged it into his laptop, and watched as the files opened. It wasn't much. Internal memos, timestamps, fragments of deleted reports, but it was enough to draw a picture. A system designed to bury mistakes, to protect uniforms instead of people. That night, he drove back to his motel, the same one he'd used years ago during training in Alabama. He sat on the bed, surrounded by papers and files connecting dots across timelines. For every incident he found, another name, another injury, another silence, 5 cases in the past year alone. All marked as resolved. All gone. And now his mother was one of them. Around midnight, he drafted an email. No name, no signature, just a subject line. Incident 927, Mount Olive Baptist, Birmingham PD. He attached the video, the records, and the timeline. Then he sent it to 3 addresses, 1 local reporter, 2 national. When he hit send, he whispered, Let's see if silence can stand against truth. The next morning, Loretta's story began to travel, first through whispers, then through posts, then through the kind of quiet outrage that spreads like fire through dry grass. Darius didn't go online. He didn't care about views or comments. He cared about eyes seeing what really happened. At sunrise, he stood outside the hospital, coffee in hand, watching the city move. Somewhere inside, Loretta was still healing, but out here, her truth was starting to breathe. He looked down the street toward the precinct and said softly, "You tried to bury her. Now the whole world's gonna dig." By sunrise, the city had already started whispering. It began like most things do, quiet, uncertain, passing from one person to another like a rumor that didn't want to die. Someone shared the video from across the street. Another person forwarded it to a cousin who worked at the radio station. Then a journalist at the Birmingham Herald saw it and hesitated for only a second before clicking post. Within hours, the story wasn't just a video anymore. It was a question. Why did this happen? By noon, that question had turned into a movement. All across the city, people began talking, in grocery lines, at barbershops, on bus stops. A 72-year-old churchwoman knocked down outside her own sanctuary just for speaking softly. The kind of story that hits deep because everyone knows someone like her. Someone gentle, harmless, who carries the weight of faith and age but still finds kindness to give. Outside Mount Olive Baptist, posters started showing up on the lampposts. They weren't fancy, just black and white printouts with a photo of Loretta lying on the pavement, her hat beside her, and the words, "Justice for Miss Loretta." Darius didn't print them. Someone else did. He saw them while driving through downtown. Every block, another one, taped to bus stops, pinned to church bulletin boards, stapled to telephone poles. It wasn't a protest yet, not loud or angry, and just steady, like the city had decided to breathe together. He parked near the hospital again and stepped out, wearing a plain gray jacket and a hat pulled low. People didn't recognize him, not yet. That's how he liked it. He wasn't there to be seen. Inside, Loretta was awake and sitting up, her Bible on her lap, flipping slowly through its pages. When she saw him, her face softened into a smile. "You seeing what's going on out there?" she asked gently. "I am," Darius said, pulling up a chair. "People talking, baby. Whole lot of folks finally paying attention." He nodded, eyes down. "They should have been paying attention long before you hit that ground." Loretta reached for his hand. "Don't let that anger swallow you. You can't fight the dark by becoming it." He met her eyes. "I'm not angry, Ma, I'm focused." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Just make sure focus don't turn into fury." He squeezed her hand once gently. "You raised me better than that." Later that afternoon, Darius sat in his truck across from the police station again. He wasn't hiding, but he wasn't announcing himself either. He watched the officers walking in and out, heads low, voices quiet. The department's parking lot looked full, but no one looked comfortable. Inside those walls, panic had begun to spread. Lieutenant Green stood in his office, holding his phone to his ear. "No, Chief, I understand," he said, pacing. "Yes, sir, we're containing it." His eyes darted to the window, where a small group of reporters had gathered. "The son's name hasn't been released publicly, but someone's feeding the media." He hung up, rubbing his forehead. He'd been a cop for 20 years, and he'd seen scandals come and go, but something about this one felt different. This wasn't a story that could be buried in paperwork. The internet had already claimed it. That evening, Darius's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "They're preparing a press statement. They'll call it a misunderstanding. Don't let them." No name, but he knew who it was. Sergeant Malone. He typed back only one word. "Understood." Then he got back to work. He called 2 men that night. Not friends, but brothers in a way only shared history can define. Galloway and Terrell. They'd served with him years ago. Both had left the uniform behind, just like him, but neither had forgotten what it meant to fight the right fight. By midnight, Galloway had arrived from Tallahassee, carrying a small canvas bag and the same limp he'd had since their last mission. Terrell drove in from Chattanooga, quiet and analytical, his laptop already humming before he even set it on the motel desk. "All right," Galloway said, settling into the creaky chair. "What mess you drag us into this time?" Darius handed them each a file. "This isn't combat. This is cleanup. My mother's the one they hurt. But they've been doing it to others too." She's just the one who got caught on camera. Galloway whistled low under his breath. And we're going up against cops now? Darius shook his head. Not cops, a system. There's a difference. Terrell started scanning the files, his fingers moving fast across the keyboard. You already triggered the media, he said. Good. That keeps them defensive. But they'll push back. You ready for that? Been ready, Darius said simply. By 2 a.m., the team had mapped out every piece of data they'd found. Detmer's prior record, the missing reports, the internal memo that read handle internally. It wasn't just negligence. It was organized protection. Somebody higher-up's controlling this, Galloway said. Too clean otherwise, Terrell nodded. There's a restricted archive. Could be where they hide sensitive case data. I can get in, but I'll need access from the inside. I know someone, Darius said. She's IA. She's trying to do the right thing. Galloway chuckled. That's rare. Exactly why we trust her. The next day, the city finally broke its silence. At noon, the Birmingham Police Department held a press conference. Reporters stood outside in the thick heat, microphones in hand, cameras ready. Lieutenant Green stepped up to the podium, flanked by 2 officers and a public relations rep. He cleared his throat, reading from a sheet of paper. The Birmingham Police Department is aware of an incident involving the use of force during a traffic stop outside Mount Olive Baptist Church. The matter is under review. One reporter shouted, Is the elderly woman in the video okay? Green hesitated. She's recovering. Another voice yelled. Why wasn't the officer suspended? We're following department procedure, he said, voice tightening. Darius watched the entire thing live on his phone. His jaw didn't move, but his eyes hardened. He knew what procedure meant. It meant delay. It meant silence disguised as patience. But outside that building, something was shifting. A crowd had gathered, not a mob, not chaos, just people. Dozens of them. Some held candles, others held small signs with Loretta's photo. A few even wore church clothes as if they'd come straight from prayer. One woman stepped forward, her voice breaking through the murmurs. She could have been my mother, she said. She is somebody's mother. The words hit like a wave. The crowd echoed it, softly at first, then louder. She is somebody's mother. Darius stood across the street, hidden among the bystanders, hands in his pockets. He didn't need to speak. The city was speaking for him now. That night, local TV ran the story again. Then national media picked it up. Then online creators, journalists, and even pastors started talking about it. For the first time in years, Darius saw something he hadn't expected. Momentum. Not born out of outrage alone, but out of recognition. People weren't just angry. They were awake. He turned off the TV and looked at Galloway and Terrell. Tomorrow, he said, we go for the truth inside the department. Galloway raised an eyebrow. And what happens when we find it? Darius's answer was quiet, steady, and certain. Then they'll have to face it. Outside, the rain started again, soft, steady, relentless. Just like him. The next morning, the city didn't wake up quietly. By 7 a.m., the streets outside the Birmingham Police Department were already crowded. Not a riot, not chaos, just people. Old women with folded chairs. Young men with cameras. Church members holding signs that read, We see you, Miss Loretta. The building stood like a red brick fortress, its windows reflecting the pale gold of sunrise. Inside, officers moved faster than usual. Phones rang nonstop. The word investigation had turned into damage control. Darius sat in his truck across the street watching it all. He hadn't slept, but his mind was clear. Galloway and Terrell sat in the back seat, both silent, waiting. You sure about this? Galloway asked. Darius nodded slowly. It's time. Terrell closed his laptop. The files are clean. Body cam footage recovered, internal messages traced, timestamps verified. If they deny it now, they're lying to the world. Darius looked toward the building. Then let's show them the truth. He stepped out of the truck, straightened his jacket, and walked across the street. The crowd noticed him but didn't cheer. They just watched, parting quietly like they somehow knew who he was. He entered through the main doors, past 2 uniformed officers who looked at him but didn't stop him. Maybe they'd seen the video. Maybe they recognized his eyes. Inside, the air was cold and tense. He walked up to the front desk. The young officer from before, the one who had called the watch commander, looked up nervously. Mr. Baines, he stammered. They're expecting you. Good, Darius said simply. He followed the officer through the hallway to a glass-walled conference room. Lieutenant Green was already there, standing by the table. Across from him sat a woman from public relations, her laptop open, fingers trembling as she typed. When Darius walked in, no one spoke for a few seconds. Green finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Baines, please have a seat." Darius stayed standing. "I'll stand. We both know this won't take long." Green shifted uncomfortably. "We're reviewing everything. Internal Affairs is involved now. Sergeant Malone has already submitted an early report." Darius placed a small hard drive on the table. The click of it hitting the wood made everyone freeze. "You'll want to start with this," he said quietly. The PR officer blinked. "What's on it?" "The raw footage," Darius replied. "From your own officer's body cam." Green's eyebrows furrowed. "That footage isn't public." "It wasn't supposed to be," Darius said. "But hiding truth doesn't erase it. It just delays accountability." He plugged the drive into the monitor on the wall. The screen flickered. The room fell silent as the video began to play. There she was, Loretta Baines, standing on the church steps, holding her cane and Bible, saying softly, "Y'all be careful now." Then the officer turned, reached, pulled. The fall was quick, cruel in its simplicity. The Bible hit the ground, the hat rolled, the crowd gasped. No resistance, no aggression. Just an old woman trying to breathe. The PR officer covered her mouth. Lieutenant Green closed his eyes. When the screen went dark, the only sound was the hum of the monitor. Darius's voice broke the silence. "That's your truth. No editing, no excuses, no policy talk. That's your officer. That's your system." Green exhaled slowly, his hands clasped tight. "You're right. There's no defense for that." "Then don't defend it," Darius said. "Fix it." Green looked at him, eyes tired. "What do you want?" "I want Officer Detmer suspended without pay. I want a public apology to my mother, face to face, not through a press statement. I want this department to reopen every use of force case sealed in the last 3 years. And I want you to stop pretending silence is the same as professionalism." The PR woman blinked rapidly. "That's not how this works." Darius turned to her, calm but sharp. "It's exactly how it works when people finally stop being afraid." Green rubbed the bridge of his nose. "You're asking for things that require city approval, review boards. You had no problem skipping procedure when it came to filing fake reports," Darius interrupted. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried enough weight to fill the room. "You can move fast when it suits you. Move fast now." Green stood still for a long moment. Then he finally said, "You'll get your apology. I'll suspend Detmer today. The rest, I need time." "You have 24 hours, Darius said flatly. "After that, this goes national. Every outlet, every lawyer, every person who's ever been told to stay quiet. And once it's out, you won't control the story anymore." Green didn't argue. He just nodded once, resigned. Darius picked up his hard drive and turned toward the door. "Thank you for your time, Lieutenant. Don't waste it." He left the room without shaking hands. Outside, the crowd was still there, quiet, holding signs, recording with their phones. Reporters shouted questions, but Darius said nothing. He just walked to the sidewalk where it had all started, the same cracked concrete where his mother's hat had landed. He stood there staring down at the spot, breathing slowly. For the first time in days, the sun broke through the clouds. Inside the building, Lieutenant Green watched from the window. He looked down at the people, then back at the PR officer. "Get the chief on the phone," he said softly. "Tell him we can't bury this anymore." That evening, the department released a statement. Officer Detmer has been placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. It was small, technical, and cold. But the next sentence changed everything. The department will issue a formal apology to Mrs. Loretta Baines. At the hospital, Loretta watched the news from her bed. She didn't smile, just nodded slowly. "Good," she whispered. "Now maybe they'll listen." When the door opened, Darius stepped in carrying flowers, simple white lilies. "They suspended him," he said. "I saw," she replied. "Does it fix what happened?" "No," Darius admitted. "But it's a start." She looked at him, eyes tired but strong. "Don't let them make you bitter, baby. You did what you had to. But remember, justice isn't the same as peace." He set the flowers on the table and sat beside her. "Then we'll work on both." The next morning, the apology came. Detmer arrived at the hospital flanked by 2 officers. His hands were shaking, his face pale. He stood at the foot of Loretta's bed, reading from a paper. "Mrs. Baines," he said, voice cracking, "I'm sorry for the harm I caused. It was never my intention." Loretta looked at him for a long, heavy moment. Her voice was steady but soft. "You may not have meant to hurt me," she said, "but you still did. And meaning don't erase memory." Detmer swallowed hard, then lowered his head. When he left, Darius stood at the door watching him go. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, just clarity. Because for him, this wasn't victory. It was responsibility. That night, the city exhaled, slowly, uncertainly. Some called it justice. Others called it too little, too late. But everyone agreed on one thing. The silence had finally been broken. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Darius sat on a bench outside the hospital, listening to the faint hum of the city. He thought about all the faces he'd seen, the people in the crowd, the reporters, the strangers who'd shown up not out of anger, but out of belief. Then he thought about his mother, strong, patient, unshaken, and whispered, "You didn't fall for nothing." In the distance, church bells began to ring, and for the first time since that night, the sound didn't hurt. 2 weeks later, the city had changed, not completely, not magically, but enough to feel it in the air. The anger that once echoed through the streets had softened into something steadier, a kind of awareness. The posters were still up, though a few had begun to curl at the edges under the fall rain. People still mentioned Loretta's name at corner stores, church steps, and barbershops, not as a victim anymore, but as a symbol. Inside the hospital, the steady beep of monitors had been replaced by silence. Loretta Baines was finally being discharged. The nurses lined up to hug her as she left, their smiles warm but bittersweet. "Gonna miss seeing you here, Miss Loretta," one of them said. Loretta smiled faintly. "You'll see me at church instead. Better lighting there." She laughed softly, but her hands trembled a little as she leaned on her cane. Darius stood behind her, steady as a shadow, ready to catch her if she stumbled. He had spent every night of those 2 weeks by her side, sleeping in a chair, answering calls, sorting through files even as the world outside began to move on. Now, as the nurse wheeled her through the glass doors, the late morning light spilled over them. The air smelled of rain and pine again, the same scent from the night it all began. Darius opened the truck door for her. She looked up at him and smiled. "Help me up, baby." He reached out not as a soldier, not as a man on a mission, but simply as a son. He took her hand, lifted her gently, and helped her into the seat. "You good?" he asked softly. "I'm better than I was," she said, "and that's enough." The drive home was quiet. The same road they'd driven 1,000 times before, but today it felt new. The world outside seemed slower, softer, as if even the wind was giving her space to heal. When they pulled up to the small yellow house on the corner, Loretta stared at it for a long moment before getting out. "Looks smaller than I remember," she said. "Hasn't changed," Darius replied. "You just been away too long." He helped her up the porch steps one by one. The wood creaked under their feet, familiar and forgiving. When they reached the top, she stopped and smiled. The porch was clean. Someone had swept it. The mailbox was freshly painted white. She tilted her head. "You do that?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am." Pinned to the new mailbox was a note written in neat handwriting on lined paper. "For Miss Loretta, thank you for standing tall even when you were on the ground. Thelma and the ladies from Mount Olive." Loretta chuckled, a sound that carried both pride and disbelief. Them women always did have a way with words. Inside, the house smelled just the same, faint lemon cleaner and old hymns lingering in the air. Someone had stocked the fridge. Someone had folded blankets on the couch. On the dining table sat a stack of letters, dozens of them. Darius picked one up. The handwriting was shaky. "Dear Miss Loretta, my mama went through something like that back in '95. Nobody believed her. Watching you made me believe again. Thank you." Loretta ran her hand across the pile, her eyes soft. "All these people. I don't even know them." "You do now," Darius said. They spent the afternoon reading every letter, one from a schoolteacher in Georgia, another from a retired nurse in Detroit, even one from a police officer who wrote anonymously, "You made me want to do better in this uniform." As the day turned to evening, Loretta walked slowly to the porch. The setting sun painted the sky orange and gold. She stood there with her cane, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The air was quiet except for the sound of a few children laughing down the street. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked without turning. Darius stepped beside her. "All the time. And?" He looked out at the sky. "I think it's time I stop reacting and start building. There's too many stories like yours, people nobody listens to until it's too late." "I can change that," she smiled faintly. "You always were your father's son." He turned toward her. "You miss him?" "Every day," she said. "But today I think he'd be proud." For a moment they said nothing. The wind brushed against the trees, carrying the faint sound of church bells from down the street. That weekend, Loretta went back to Mount Olive Baptist for the first time. The congregation stood when she walked in. No fanfare, no music, just respect. Reverend Ingram met her at the door and guided her to her usual seat at the front. "Glad to have you home." "Sister Baines," he said, smiling. "Glad to be home." "Reverend," she replied. As the choir began to sing, Darius stayed in the back row, watching his mother raise her head high, eyes closed, lips moving to the old hymns she'd sung for decades. For the first time since everything happened, she looked at peace. After the service, a woman in her 60s approached Darius. Her name was Bernice. She held her purse like it contained something precious. "You don't know me," she said, "but I wanted to thank you for what you did, for not letting them forget her." He nodded politely. "Ma did most of that herself." Bernice smiled. "Still, you reminded folks that quiet strength ain't weakness. Sometimes standing still is its own kind of power." Darius didn't know what to say. He just nodded, humbled, and looked toward his mother, laughing softly with her church friends. That evening he sat on the porch with a notebook in his lap. It was half filled with notes, names, dates, cities, stories people had sent him after hearing about Loretta. Each one was another person who'd been hurt and forgotten. He wasn't collecting them out of anger. He was collecting them out of duty. Loretta stepped outside, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one and sat beside him. "You still working?" she asked. "Just thinking." "About what?" He looked down at his notes. "About starting something, a foundation maybe. Something that helps people who don't get heard. Victims, families, anyone who's been pushed aside by the system." She took a sip of her coffee. "That's a big thing to carry." "I've carried heavier," he said softly. Loretta smiled, looking out at the street. "Then do it. Just make sure you carry it with kindness." They sat there for a while, the sound of cicadas filling the evening air. A young boy on a bicycle rode past and waved. "Hey, Miss Loretta, you feeling better?" She waved back, grinning. "I'm still here, baby." When the boy rode off, she turned to Darius and said, "That's what matters." "I'm still here," he nodded, his voice low. "You are? And because you are, so many others will be too." As night fell, Darius looked at the small yellow house glowing under the porch light. He thought about the way everything had unfolded, from the church steps to the hospital to this quiet peace. It hadn't been revenge that changed the city. It was truth. Simple, undeniable truth. He looked at his mother again, her face lit softly by the porch light, and realized something. Strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. The world had tried to silence Loretta Baines, but in doing so, it made her voice echo louder than ever. Weeks later, news broke that the police chief had resigned. An independent board had reopened 4 old cases. Reporters called it the Baines effect. Darius didn't give interviews. He didn't want credit. He just kept working quietly, helping other families tell their stories. And Loretta? She went back to teaching, not at school but at the church reading program for kids who'd fallen behind. Every Sunday afternoon, she'd sit with them under the stained glass windows, reading stories about courage, kindness, and hope. Sometimes one of the kids would ask, "Miss Loretta, that video of you online, were you scared?" She'd smile and say, "A little." But sometimes fear is just faith waiting to stand up. On quiet nights, Darius would sit on the porch with his notebook and hear her humming from inside. The sound was soft, full of life. And in those moments, he knew the fight had been worth it. Not because he'd won, but because she was still standing. The story of Loretta Baines and her son wasn't one of revenge. It wasn't even about one city or one family. The power of a single voice, the strength of truth, and the way love, even in silence, can shake the walls of power. As the screen fades, Loretta's voice echoes softly. You don't have to be loud to be heard. You just have to speak when it matters. And somewhere in Birmingham, the bells of Mount Olive ring, steady, warm, unbroken.